Um, okay, for everyone who's on the call, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Michael Bernard. I'll be today's webinar moderator. I am Database and Operations Manager for the Self-Represented Litigation Network. I'd like to begin with a few announcements and instructions for our audience before we get to the session itself. First, please use the chat bubble in the top of your screen to submit your questions for our presenters. Our webinar today will last approximately 50 minutes, after which there will be about 10 minutes for our presenters to address questions from you, our audience. Chat will be live during the webinar, and I will monitor the questions as they come in. The webinar is also being recorded, and the full recorded session along with the webinar slides will be posted on the event and registration page at srln.org after the live event has ended. Today's webinar is entitled Learning from Each Other, How the People's Law Library and JustAdvice Clinic Coordinate Their Distinct Missions to Advance Justice in Maryland. The webinar is being presented by the Maryland People's Law Library and the JustAdvice Clinic in cooperation with SRLN. I'm joined today by two presenters. Lee Maddox is a clinical professor with the Francis King Carey School of Law at the University of Maryland, and she manages the nationally recognized JustAdvice Clinic. The JustAdvice Clinic is a law firm on wheels run by student attorneys and staffed by volunteer attorneys, social work students, and medical students that has served over 3,000 clients in 16 communities in Maryland. Joining Lee is Dave Panzer, manager of the Maryland's People Law Library, where he leads a network of volunteer attorneys, librarians, government employees, and students in creating, editing, and updating legal information articles. You can find more information on the People's Law Library and the JustAdvice Clinic on their websites, which are respectively www.peoples-law.org and at JustAdviceClinic, all one word, .org. With that, I will pass the mic over to our presenters for today's discussion, starting with Dave Panzer. Dave?
Thanks, Mike. Thank you all for joining us today for what's exciting for us to have the opportunity to tell you about a project we've been working on together for really a little over a year now, but we're kind of coming up on year one of the active part of this project. As Michael said, we represent two different organizations, and what we find interesting and maybe worth telling the story of right now is how we've brought these two organizations together to do something that neither of us could do independently, in addition to the things that we can do on our own. And kind of underscoring, anytime we give a webinar, it's our policy to have our PR machine go way in front of us, so we arranged for the Washington Post today to have a front page story above the fold in the paper edition about the creative and innovative programs that law schools like the University of Maryland are doing to help their graduates be competitive in the changing legal market. And as you can see on just this little one-sentence blurb at the beginning, they're talking right here about courses that bring more writing and more externships into the picture. And it's interesting that some leaders of different law schools are quoted in the article, one saying, "Every single law school that I know of is doing something to not only innovate, but also to add value to what they're giving to students." And that was the dean of George Washington Law School. The dean of Villanova School of Law said that that school is now requiring students to take a course on the economics of a law firm in case they decide to start their own practice. And so as you'll hear, a lot of what JustAdvice and People's Law together is able to do hit some of these themes about preparing for practical aspects of legal work and also ramping up the writing. So before that article came out, we already saw the challenge. The challenge fundamentally in Maryland is the justice gap, is this statistic that says that 80% of the poor in Maryland don't have the benefit of a lawyer to help them with their legal needs. So that's the justice gap, and of course there are many approaches to trying to help alleviate that. And they kind of fall on a spectrum, and from information up through representation with a couple of different types of help along the way. Now, the People's Law Library, which I'll just quickly explain, is a website that helps to meet the information end of that spectrum. The People's Law Library is run through the State Law Library, the Maryland State Law Library, and is part of the judiciary. So this part of the project is an expression of the Maryland judiciary. We see it as a fundamentally educational mission. Our central mission is to educate all Marylanders about particularly civil legal matters that self-represented litigants most frequently face in state court. So the website, if you were to go to the People's Law Library website, it looks like this, and I say that there are kind of three things that we try to do with the website. The first is to try to connect self-represented litigants with lawyers. If we can get people legal help, that is our first order of business. And so there are all these different keys around every page of the website to help people connect online, on the phone, in person, with lawyers, law firms, legal services organizations, law librarians, to help answer questions, respond to needs. Just one example of that we keep on the website is the Legal Services Directory, which is a list of the Maryland Legal Services Corporation, grantee organizations, and a host of other legal services organizations in the state that a person can go on and they can say what county they're in and what type of service they're looking for, and the site will give them a list of the organizations that might be able to help them and help them to connect with a map and a phone number and an email address and things like that. The second thing we try to do on the site is to bring some understanding about the general process, the legal process in Maryland. So we have information that's general in scope to help people understand the courts. For instance, this is one example when you've been sued in small claims court, and this is one page that tries to help people understand in general terms the types of options that people have when dealing with certain situations. The third thing we do, and I'll say that there are about 450 to 500 articles of one kind or another on the site. The third thing we do is these substantive legal articles that unpack specific legal topics. And these are written in plain English, and they have certain features that we bake in. So the more popular articles, many of them are translated into other languages, primarily Spanish, but also some of the most popular articles are translated into a number of languages. And you can see this additional resources at the bottom. This is an educational mission, and we try to connect people with further resources through links and even through books that they could use to understand more clearly. The other thing we do, for example, where this red arrow is pointing, is we link to the actual text of the law. In addition to explaining the law in plain English, we link to the General Assembly's website, which is a working copy of the Maryland Code. And so we'll link directly to statutes for people. Whether it's because of the justice gap growing or whatever the reason, we're seeing that page views on the site are steadily increasing. And so these are monthly page views on the site by year for the data we have, average monthly page views. So you can see there's a sort of a steady incline. The other thing that's interesting that we can see through Google Analytics is we can track how many people are using computers and how many people are using iPhones and iPads and things like that to get to the site. Interestingly, a great many people are using smartphones as opposed to computers. So we've adjusted the site to allow anybody with a smartphone to have a law library in their pocket. How do we keep all this up to date? Well, it's really hard. So we have to use absolutely every partnership, every community resource, every volunteer lawyer that we can connect with. And what's really wonderful is when we can find a partner where we can give back and where there can be synergy in that relationship. And that has been the case with JustAdvice. So I will turn it over to Lee to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Dave. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So this is I want to give you a little bit of an organizational overview about JustAdvice. We essentially are a law firm on wheels. It's student-run and led. Essentially, for $10, anyone can come in off the street and get 30 minutes with an attorney. We hold 2 sessions per week here in Baltimore City. One session is at the district courthouse, and the other session rotates around through different community centers throughout the city. Every session is staffed with approximately 8 to 10 law students, 2 social work students, 2 medical students, and 4 to 5 volunteer attorneys. The law students do they do all the behind-the-scenes work you would see in any law firm, but during the actual session, they do the actual intake, they try to issue spot, figure out what is going on, and then they go and they consult with this team of wonderful volunteer attorneys. They shop, if you will, for the best attorney with the most knowledge about the legal issue the client is facing. They collaborate, they do on-the-spot research, often through people's law library, and try to figure out a plan of action to deliver to the client. Then they go and give the advice. We do additional referrals when necessary, and we do exit surveys by someone who is not associated with the project. The law students are on site to do nutritional advice and guidance and blood pressure screenings, and the social work students are on site to help when people start crying and when they break down because of the stress of their legal situation, or if they're having problems with housing, employment, or any other wide array of social issues. So basically the timeline, how we got to be where we are, in 2008 we began researching and conceptualizing the program. We went live in 2009 in a small community in Cherry Hill in Baltimore City. And we continued going, and in 2011 we rebranded for the reasons listed on the previous slide from Legal Grind to JustAdvice. We've been going strong now for 18 continuous semesters. More than 200 law students, 30 social work students, and 15 medical students have come through the program. So as you can see, our client base has steadily risen over the years, and our total average of clients per session continues to go up as well. We started off with only having maybe 4 or 5 people there, and now we've got maybe 16. And our last session, we had 22 people at the district court. I think our record was 32 at Lexington Market, but we've seen an overall increase of 251% since the project's inception in 2009. Also, you can see that there are some differences in the number of clients we serve by term. All terms, the client base is continuing to steadily rise, but most of our clients come during the spring and the fall. Our mission, obviously, is to provide affordable and low-cost services. We try to empower our clients, and we try to make justice accessible by being mobile so that we can get to the people that are needed. We have unique attributes. There was a study done in 2013 that studied all other law schools and other law-related delivery mechanisms within the country, and we found that none had all 6 of these unique attributes: community outreach and attorney engagement and legal education being particularly important, along with the interdisciplinary approach. So this is just an example of our organizational structure. It does fluctuate from semester to semester depending on how many students we have and what sort of interests they have. This is the current one that we are using this semester. Essentially, the students are broken into teams. They do financing and accounting just like you would in a firm. They do marketing, website development, operations, and informational systems. So you can kind of see how the teams are breaking up. The students are put onto multiple teams. They have to interact on multiple issues and work together cohesively just like they would in a firm. And it has been really amazing to see how they are able to drive the message forward. We are nothing without our partners, and ironically, People's Law Library is not listed on here. We will have to change that. But we do embrace many local partners doing well here in the city, and we couldn't have done any of this without them. We've served many locations with a total of 322 sessions, and we've now eclipsed 3,500 in terms of the people that we have helped. Referrals are a critical part of any law firm because you can't handle everything, and we have found that our referral rate is about 53%. So those cases we refer out to that 42% is civil justice. Civil justice is a network of small and solo practitioners. They come and actually volunteer through grants, from government grants. They come and volunteer for us, and we refer cases back to their network. And their network has been very supportive in doing sliding scale work for our clients that can't afford to hire a boutique law firm. For those who can or have cases with money in them, we refer those to the private bar. It's a whopping 34% of our clients go into the capable hands of the private bar. The rest of the pie there is Maryland Legal Services Corporation organizations. We're committed to supporting their mission, and whenever we have clients that appear they will present and stick with that organization, we make referrals there as well. The Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service has been particularly important in that connect. So as part of our marketing, we do a master schedule every year. We do a mass mailing, and we send that out to folks all over the place. And then we also follow up with our web-based presence, our promotional videos. We go to community-based events. We send, like I said, flyers around, and then we have all these great giveaway items. The stress balls are one of the biggest things that the clients love. Aside, we also have brownies and water on site at every session because we do try to create a holistic environment where people feel, and it's funny because the medical students actually pushed back on us about the brownies, and so they've started bringing healthy snacks and did nutritional labeling on everything so that people can make informed decisions. I said that people under legal stress should still be able to have brownies, so they're still there, but they do have choices. So, as always...
Ironically, the regulation is coming from the medical side, not from the legal side.
Ironically. As always, we're concerned about what the students and the attorneys and the clients feel and think about the work that we're doing. We are concerned about the educational benefits, always trying to hone professionalism among the colleagues. Issue spotting is so critical. And the students have really embraced this as a way to transition into the real world once they graduate. The areas of law that we see, as you can see, there are a lot of different areas. Property, that spike you see on this slide here, I attribute to the district court. We see about 40% of the property issues that come through are landlord-tenant issues, and most of those come through the district court location. We also see a significant amount of family law. I make it a point to have a family law attorney on site at each session because we know that we will get a good amount, and guardianship is increasingly becoming popular with elderly and disabled folks and their families. We also do a fair amount of business law, as you can see, consumer law and bankruptcy. A lot of that stuff is coming in through the courts. People come in with their civil pleadings, and we try to help them work through that. This slide here makes me a little bit insane, but it does kind of give you an idea of how nimble our attorneys have to be when they come to JustAdvice. And it does also speak to the need for on-the-spot research, hence our relationship with the People's Law Library, because there's no way that any attorney can know everything about all law, and the best we can do is try to figure it out quickly and give people a strong roadmap so they don't feel quite so lost. My students are very, very proud of this slide because they scored higher than the attorneys did on professionalism, but we always stress the Maryland rules of professional responsibility and civility and treating people with respect, no presumption of literacy, and I think that is felt by our clients and appreciated. We work in a collaborative environment. It is multidisciplinary, as I mentioned earlier, and we recruit volunteers from all over the place, including the local bar, and we just do our best to do outreach and build relationships and go out and just be present as much as we can, just to give the students as much educational exposure to what it's like to work with a network of attorneys and the community. So the student impact, the students consistently say good things. Now, these are pre-grade quotes. I don't think they'll change. These students are awesome, but they really love understanding that there is a place where they can go out and do good outside of the classroom and be able to help people. And to have the opportunity to impact someone's life, real time, makes you remember why you went to law school. The attorneys have been equally impacted by this. Stan Rode was a 40-year attorney. He made a lot of money doing a lot of good medical malpractice work, and he was determined when he retired to come back and give back, and he has done that, and I can't say enough. He's there at every session, and he's just amazing. And Dee is another wonderful practicing attorney. She's younger, and she comes in, and she has a great attitude, and she expresses to us that she walks away with more energy and more love for the law after every session because of the students and the impact that they have on her. Our clients are equally, can't please everybody, obviously. We deal with a base that sometimes you can't help, but people consistently appreciate that we were helpful in helping them. And they say good things, which keeps me going. And a big thing is that we are able to answer the legal question. Sometimes we tell them to put it in a box and put it away. Sometimes because it's moot or its statute of limitations is passed, sometimes we tell them, hey, you know what? You're sophisticated enough. You can do this yourself. Let me give you a roadmap. And sometimes we tell them, you know what? I'm sorry, you can't do this yourself. We have to find you a lawyer, and we're going to try to find you the best one that we can. We have received recognition. I'm very grateful of that. It's been wonderful to see the work that we've been doing, getting some national attention in hopes that maybe it can be replicated. We have tried expanding the services in a number of different ways. We've been doing some unbundled legal services. We've had rule changes here in Maryland, and we've been doing simple wills and other documents at reduced rates. We have also been doing fee waivers for veterans for years and years, and I'm sure we will continue to do so. And we also did an expansion outside of Baltimore City to the lower Eastern Shore for a few years to try to help people who even have less access to justice in the remote part of the state. And that was really a wonderful project for the students post-Hurricane Sandy and other projects. The vision, as I see it, is to create a sustainable model that can be implemented and taken to other places in the country. And I think that it's possible. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that we really saw the need for on-the-spot research, and we found ourselves going to the People's Law Library a lot. And that's sort of how Dave and I got to know each other, and the students went to the work to do an analysis of People's Law, and I'll let Dave talk a little more about that, but that has kind of driven this next phase of the project and our discussion.
Great. Thanks, Lee. And so I guess what you can see here is sort of you have a sense of what the People's Law Library does, you have a sense of what the JustAdvice Clinic does, and now we sort of transition into how we work together to do both of those things better. First of all, I've known Lee for a little while, and this analysis that her students did a couple of years ago of sort of a systematic analysis of the People's Law Library, going through topic by topic and giving suggestions on what things were clear, where there were some holes that were needed. The challenge with the People's Law Library is it's a website, and we're kind of blind about the users. We can see certain, our analytics, we can see what people are looking at, but we can't see if we're being helpful. And so the connection with students on the ground was one that was very beneficial to us. When we started exploring the things we had in common, part of that was in the context of a veterans clinic that looked like it might come to pass at the University of Maryland. And so we were together within this kind of broader community talking about the different strengths we would bring to the table, and the kind of just an indication of how organic partnerships like this are. They come and they change and they go and they come back and they change again. The Veterans Clinic didn't end up happening, but out of that whole process, Lee and I had more opportunity to basically brainstorm about the things we'll talk to you now about. That was in 2013 and maybe early 2014. We've been actively working with students since the summer of 2014. So we're kind of 1 year in, and this is part of our reflective process, is kind of talking this through and sharing the story. So the first group of students that we worked with there were, I think, 12 students in the summer clinic in 2014. And we learned about the process through that. I'll get to some lessons learned a little bit later in this, but in the 2014-2015 school year, there was a second batch of students, and so we had sort of a greater amount of time to invest in this second round of students, and we had the benefit of the lessons that we had learned the first time through. So more or less the basic point of this for the students is that they get to develop their writing and publish on the People's Law Library. Also, in the full year model, they get to do some legal editing of existing materials and sharpen their legal research, and in a very practical context where it's going to benefit the whole community and them themselves when they're out in the community helping people on the fly. So as we designed the partnership, we talked a little bit about some of the things we had in common and some of our goals. And the literature on some of these academic community partnerships suggests that, not surprisingly, a well-designed partnership is founded on shared vision and clearly articulated values, and is going to need to be beneficial to both partnering institutions. The way I would unpack that, Lee approached me kind of early with some thoughts, and we did a little bit of thinking together, and there's this research about practical lawyering skills and professionalism. Again, this harkens back to the Washington Post article, and the Schultz and Zadek had listed a bunch of attributes that would be necessary for students to learn to be prepared to practice law and to enter the community. This isn't the full list that they came up with, but these were the ones that were just kind of obvious home runs for the People's Law Library and the JustAdvice Clinic to develop. In terms of the benefits that we foresaw, certainly, as I've said, we needed help with understanding how to grow the site and how to develop it. Obviously, we needed help with doing the research and writing. We can do some of that, but we always need more help with that. And then this idea of a pipeline of informed professionals, we really want to build into, and we do this in many ways through the state bar and through the government and through the legal services organizations. We really try to build into the profession, and we see the law school as, in some ways, the gatekeeper of the profession, and want to kind of get the idea of clear writing and the need to meet real people with this justice gap to meet the needs of the 80% as a value. So those were the things that we obviously could foresee.
And from the perspective of JustAdvice, I knew just from watching the students struggle when the attorneys asked them to draft a simple pleading or a simple letter or a simple will, that they were having a very difficult time walking away from their legal ease. They were a very difficult time writing in a way that the average person could understand what they were trying to say. So it was clear to me that they needed to be taught more clear writing. They needed consistent and engaged feedback. And then there's also that piece of understanding what the needs of the community are, and how do you write for that? And so that's what we were hoping on this end to gain.
And then there were things that came along that we didn't necessarily anticipate, but that became powerful drivers of the partnership. And one of this we just call synergy of access to the client point of view and professionalism, is just this team approach that brought other lawyers that we'll talk about in a minute into the process that became really helpful. So moving from designing the partnership to implementing it, there were a few hurdles we had to, or decisions we had to make, and things that we discovered. So very briefly, in terms of the relationships and responsibilities, we each took on, in the format of a partnership, we each took on a part of this. The People's Law Library was ultimately the organization to determine which projects to offer students to do. So what were our needs? We were informed by the students, but then we were going to be the final people saying, well, these are the articles we're going to write. In terms of clear writing instruction, I came in and taught some classes and went through some of the psychology of clear writing and some best practices and some tips and some tools, and kind of pushed back on some a little bit of pushback about, whether you could be clear without being inaccurate. And the answer to that is you can. And then I would provide some feedback to the students as well.
And then my role in this was the professional perspective, always encouraging the students to view everything through the lens of the Maryland Rules of Professional Responsibility and Civility. And I also was able to put them in teams, monitor the teams, make sure the teams were working, make sure that they were producing material, make sure they were not giving Dave a hard time, and of course, evaluating and grading the work that they were able to produce.
And then, things that we were both kind of on board with was just this shared sense of struggle together forward, and motivating the students into
Kumbaya.
that. It took some kumbaya at times. So that's nice, you say. You've just explained that. What did it look like? This is kind of the model that the picture that we use to explain what happened. The students would understand the problem to be unpacked and explained. I would do instruction, and then there was a procedure of writing drafts, and those drafts would be submitted to Lee as the faculty. They would be submitted to me for help with clear writing, and then there was the red ball at the top, the subject matter experts. This was critical, and this was where the value kind of came in. Was we had attorneys from the community, from the Attorney General's office, from Maryland Maryland Volunteer Lawyers Service, from the law school,
Public Justice Center,
state government employees come in to vet the students' work from a specialist's eye to make sure that they were getting things right. And so there was this dialogue that would go back and forth. A draft would bounce back and forth between clarity and accuracy, and the output in the end was tremendous, which we'll get to the specifics of the output. In terms of the writing instruction process, that was a challenge. We started with a baseline of this book, Plain English for Lawyers, and that took us so far. In fact, the late Maryland Access to Justice Commission donated a whole bunch of brand new copies of this book at our request to the program, and so students have been given copies of this book. But then what we found, there is some good literature out there on clear writing, but there wasn't everything we needed in terms of, there's a lot of negative advice about things not to do. What we needed to develop was some positive advice on how to conceive the whole process. So you'll see that a lot of these little screenshots look like they're Word documents, because they are, because we had to develop them as part of this. And I'll just point out the last document in particular is called Am I Done Yet? And that was a refrain, I guess, in a complex process. It's important to point to a clear ending point and say, if you have gone through each of these steps, then you're ready to submit your draft. Finally, we saw some new opportunities. I'll just say really quickly, the JustAdvice students do a exit interview with each client, and they were able to introduce a question of whether the client knew about the People's Law Library, and they were able to give out promotional material for the People's Law Library. And that was helpful because 30 minutes of a lawyer's time may unstick a process for somebody, but it may not be enough, and we really wanted to point people toward another legal resource. Also, there was an interesting example. One of the students at one point pointed out that she had been helping somebody with a problem in the JustAdvice Clinic, and part of her research she was doing into some Baltimore City law, housing law, and she suddenly realized that the material she was using seemed familiar because it was the same material she had been working on editing and updating. And so, we had this kind of convergence of our two missions in one person in one place. So that was pretty neat to hear about.
So Dave and I would meet periodically, once every couple of weeks, just to kind of make sure that we were on the same page, do the check-in, make sure the students were meeting both of our expectations, and the program, if it needed any tweaking or modifying, we would make decisions on how to go about doing that. At some point, we got excited about it, and Dave saw an opportunity to do a presentation in D.C. and wrote a proposal, and we traveled down there to Crystal City.
Yeah, so the National Legal Aid and Defenders Association annual meeting we had the opportunity to speak to that audience. This was a neat part of our reflective process, too. The picture that's on the slide has Lee and then Susan Francis of Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service, who is one of our subject matter experts and kind of a champion of the program, Eric Kim, who is a student in the clinic, and myself. And so we got to go tell the story from the perspective of every one of the participants. So that was a good opportunity to kind of come up for air in the process and think back and reflect on how we could make improvements.
And one of the most amazing parts of the presentation for me was sitting back and listening to Eric and his student reflection. He categorized his experience as being in 3 stages. He says, initially I was in denial, then I became depressed, and then I was accepted and felt rewarded. So in the beginning, he was in denial. He felt like he was confused. He didn't understand what he was supposed to be doing. He had a hard time picking his topic, and he settled, oddly enough, on Section 8 housing. I can't think of anything more convoluted that he might have picked. And then he had to sit with that and try to figure out what to do. Eventually, he moved into this, what he categorizes as the depression or bargaining phase, and when he was ready to do serious research. And he did a lot of research with help from his ALR class, and then he had an epiphany. He said, this writing is so hard. I paid so much money to go to law school to sound sophisticated, and now I am limited to layperson terms. But then he went back and he spoke to a subject matter expert again, and he was amazed at how helpful the subject matter expert was now that Eric actually had an understanding of the law that they were going to discuss. And that's when he felt the reward. And he said that despite the workload, it was worth it in the end because he was able to see how his work directly impacted the community. He was included as a part of the community, and he got his article published online. So it had huge benefits all the way around.
So in terms of what we've accomplished, just to celebrate the ground we've taken here, these are all articles, the top set of about a dozen articles that are now published on the site out of this. So Marylanders are benefiting from the work of these students already. Some of the top articles there, the first 4 are articles that came out of an earlier semester, and so those are the numbers of page views that Google Analytics has picked up for those articles. So they're, in terms of this publication opportunity, I sort of tell students something like, this is an opportunity to be published. You can put this on your resume. It may not be the Harvard Law Review in terms of prestige, but it's going to be very practically beneficial to people, and it will be read far more often than your case note would be if you published it in the Harvard Law Review. The forming a stock corporation, that one has a little bit of a lower number, but it's only been up on the site for a shorter amount of time. And then the estate management ones and some of these others haven't gotten up on the site, or have just gotten up on the site, or are in final process. This is some screenshots of some of the great work the students have done. I'm especially excited about that estate management one up in the corner, because as you can see, there's this whole blue box of links. The work that the students did ended up being voluminous, and instead of a single sort of topic on small estates, which is kind of the goal, they ended up really generating essentially a manual that will be greatly beneficial to the public and to the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service, who basically commissioned that piece. In terms of what we've learned, there's a few things. Some of them have been positive, some of them have been negative. I want to quickly harken back to something Lee said. The student who presented at the NLADA with us and went through those 3 stages, part of the acceptance stage or the reward stage at the end was when they realized that by, as they said, I spent all this money to learn how to speak in a high-sounding manner, only to be told to then break it back down into plain English. What happened there is that by forcing himself to come out, to stop hiding behind high-sounding language and to push himself to explain legal concepts accurately in smaller words, I think he found a new level of understanding for himself, and thereafter was able to impart that understanding in his writing. So that's kind of a takeaway, is there's this process that can be a frustrating one, but by pushing through it, we get these sort of counterintuitive results where we actually learn more by seemingly stepping backward into plain English. And yeah, in fact, there was a study that I shared with the students that showed that while people think that by using longer words and more elaborate language they will sound smarter, the reverse is true. And in the study, they used a very crude technique of using the Microsoft Word thesaurus to kind of, in a brute force manner, use synonyms to bring the syllables of words down and make it simpler. It's the worst possible editing strategy you could have. But when they shopped those out to the respondents, what they found was that people's estimation of the intelligence of the authors actually went up just by using less complex language, even when it was done that way. So we want to teach them how to do it right. Some of the things we've learned, I've got this slide up here. I won't necessarily touch on every single point, but we want to leave some time for questions, but I'll hit a few of these. I found that we needed to, communication was the main challenge here. Anytime you bring 2 institutions together across a distance and across expectations, as Lee said, we had to find ways to talk, we had to find ways to communicate about what was going on. I found that the subject matter experts, these lawyers, bless them, who came into this process to just help, I had to learn to communicate expectations more clearly with them about timelines and about very specific aspects of the expectations of what they were participating in. Something like no busy work and very limited exercises. There was maybe initially a temptation to, in the instructional phase, use some things that were not, that were busy work. And that kind of goes against the whole ethic here of being practical and making a difference with every bit of energy that we have. And
we found it was very important to match, as best we could, the research that the students were being tasked with the problems they were seeing in the field, so that they could understand that this wasn't just some amorphous challenge to see if they could. Yeah.
So and that, I think, led to the connection that student made, seeing her own work come to fruition in the clinic. I think some things that we need to do is maybe inspire students more about the potential and need for this type of work. I think some of it is just telling the story to the students, enhancing the sense of expectation that this is the sort of work that the students will be doing. And kind of to wrap up here, there are different models that a law school could use to partner, or that a specific clinic could use to partner with a statewide website, legal information website, and Lee has maybe just a little bit of insight on some of those possible models.
Well, yeah, so Dave and the People's Law Library could be the client, which essentially would hold the student responsible for managing that client relationship and understanding the expectations. The model I think that we used would be more of a consultant model where Dave came in and worked regularly with the team as needed. And I think maybe a more effective model might actually be the equal partner model to give Dave the stick that he might need, input and grading and whatnot, whether it be through an adjunct or, a clinical instructor. But having the foot in the law library is equally as important as having the foot in the law school, because neither model works unless you've got us working together.
So Michael's pointing out that questions for Q&A can be submitted in the chat window. We have about another 15 minutes, and we'd love to have any questions you have. It's just worth saying here in the final bullet point that the current students have to help drive future priorities, and that's sort of in a nutshell what this whole partnership was about, was taking the student intelligence on the ground and applying it back to us, and then taking the resources that we could provide as the People's Law Library and making those available in a targeted fashion to the needs of the clinic students. So I'm going to go on to this last slide, which just shows how you can do Q&A, and we're grateful for your time and to have the opportunity to share this with you. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in on the chat window, and we'll read them aloud and respond, and I'll give you a minute for that.
And as an alternative, no one has submitted through the chat window. We welcome our audience members to do that. Also, if you would like to ask a question directly, you can press *6 on your keypad and just speak through your phone and ask the question. First, I'll start with a question I just got over the chat window, which is about whether or not this is a pre-legal incubator. I'm not sure what they're referring to.
Yeah, well, I know exactly what they're referring to. It is pre-incubator, yes, in that it is actually teaching law students how to run a firm, but it is not post-graduation. So they are still enrolled, and some of them are second-year students, and some of them are third-year students. So it's not, it hasn't been categorized as a pre-legal incubator, but it certainly does fit that model, yes.
Okay.
So, looks like we got another one.
Do you want to go ahead and just read it out, or?
Does Maryland have statewide court forms when writing articles like the estate management one? Are procedures laid out simply or specific to county, or for this practice area, are procedures uniform throughout the state? How do you provide relevant information to everyone? Whew.
And the much simpler question that just came in, are the slides available for our review after the presentation? Yes, they will be made available. So if you wanted to pick up on any of that.
So Maryland does have statewide court forms, absolutely. You can go on the court website, and there are a wide variety of forms.
But part of the specific challenge of this one was that there are pieces of the process that are different county by county. And so that was actually part of the challenge. That was part of why this article that turned into a suite of articles was challenging, and part of what the students did was develop a little bit of a county by county directory of information, and some of that was just going to end up being contact information where you can get information, but for some of them some of the counties, they were able to develop some tips and specifics that would unpack some of the general state principles county by county, and that's gets to something that we didn't talk a lot about, but across the site, there are these different types of articles, and some of them are going to be overviews of a legal topic matter, And students can write that stuff, but it's probably not ideal for students to write these broad overviews because it takes significant practice experience to have the sort of sense of how to weight out those sorts of materials appropriately. Another type of article on the People's Law Library is the set of options article. So I'm dealing with this situation, what are my options? That's closer to what a student can take on because that, there can be sources that can guide a student pretty specifically in that. The third way we sort of conceptualize, and we push the students to think about the topic that they're working on and analyze who their audience is likely to be, what questions the audience members will have, and then what type of article is appropriate to meet the need. So the third type of article would be more of a how-to. Once you've decided on a course of action, what are the practical steps to take? I think in some ways that's the best starting point for a student because that's pretty clear. You can be sure if you got that right or wrong. And then the fourth is a jurisdiction by jurisdiction look. And so there were items of both. There were probably items of all four of those built into that estates article.
It was a heavy lift.
So I'll just ask you a question, Lee. I know that at one point you were doing a technology corner as a part of your clinic. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So about 2 years ago, we received a grant through the Baltimore City Bar Foundation that procured some technical equipment and software that allowed us to do a live chat with people in more rural areas, people who were homebound, and then people that just simply couldn't get to our sessions. So we would have a bank of 3 computers, one being run by the student, one being run by student number 2, and one being run by the attorney. And they would do this whole intake process electronically, trying to figure out what was going on, and then be able to transfer, do issue spotting, and then transfer it to the attorney for full advice. And then the attorney would transfer the conversation back to the student attorney to give the appropriate referrals. And they were all together and talking together. And the thought was eventually we could take it to a point where they didn't need to be in the same room, and the attorney could do this from anywhere, and it could really significantly increase our attorney base. What we found was that the learning curve for these students was too high. It was impossible for them to figure out how to do it in time enough to take it live in really one semester. It was too complicated. So we tabled it. The advice from the students, the recommendation was that actually be a separate standalone clinic. So that was all that they need to focus on, because trying to do that during session when we had anywhere from 17 to 30 people running around, it just got to be a little bit too much.
And I guess that theme of what is too much and what is the appropriate level of push is one that will be part of every clinical experience, at least in my own experience. And that's one of our takeaways from this, was to be very intentional about the process that we go through and maybe use a ramping up aspect of the work to help students have some early success and give them plenty of time to do the research they need to do in order to write one of these articles.
So here's another question. With the Technology Corner project, was only chat considered, or has Skype been looked at as an option? I wonder if face-to-face would have more success, or perhaps that wouldn't have made a difference. So we did the research, legal research on this to figure out which technology to use. We ended up going with Live Client, which was already being used by the district court and was being used by, because we were concerned about attorney-client confidentiality. We ultimately decided that Skype would have been fine as well, but it didn't lend itself to being able to transfer to an attorney. It wasn't as user-friendly. I think in my world, face-to-face is always better. And when I envisioned doing a Skype chat, I always thought we can Skype in a tax attorney, but I want a general practice attorney sitting next to the client to help interpret, to make sure that nothing gets lost in translation, to make sure that the documents that the client is presenting are explained clearly to the attorney and or scanned over, and they can walk through them together so that nothing gets lost.
And I'll just say that one other kind of program like the Technology Corner that to some extent came out of this was the People's Law Library Fellows Program, which is something that we've just started where the State Law Library is actually hiring some recent graduates and actually third-year law students to do work for the People's Law Library, to do some of the research and writing, editing work. And that was something that I had talked with Lee about, and it kind of went to that whole, the set of professionalism, attributes, and practical skills that we were trying to build in that I think the law schools are striving to build into the education process, and that the whole legal community, in our experience, has been coming together around. So that's something that has taken root, and we have just recently hired our first 3 People's Law Library Fellows for short-term assignments, and we will be doing that again at the end of the summer, hopefully.
Because Dave is a rock star.
Good to have good partners. So, well, I don't know if there are any last questions. It looks like we're getting pretty close to 2 o'clock, but
if anyone had any other questions, either *6 or through the chat window. Otherwise, I'll just use, if you don't, did Lee or Dave, did you want to mention anything else on any of the topics you've covered?
Just to say that the slides will be available, and we'll put our contact information on them so that if people do have after-the-fact questions.
And we would also be very interested in any feedback from this call so we can continue to tweak and improve our programs moving forward. Great.
Definitely. So I'll go ahead and bring the question and answer session to a close. I really want to thank our presenters, Lee Maddox from the JustAdvice Clinic and Dave Panzer of the Maryland's People's Law Library. If audience members want to review the slides or the webinar from the webinar, or view the full recorded session or pass it on to friends or colleagues, you'll be able to find it at the event registration page where you previously registered and viewed event information. That link is in your chat window as we speak. I will also be sending out a post-webinar survey for you to provide feedback on today's session. If you take a few minutes to complete the survey, the responses help us improve the content of the webinars and create new ones on topics of interest. And with that, thank you all very much. Please have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you again, Lee and Dave.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.